Hello and welcome to Trending Daily. I'm Makhdoom Shahabuddin. For years, Narendra Modi has presented himself as the face of clean governance, transparency, and development. But when we move beyond political speeches and look at the government records, court judgments, and financial disclosures, a different and much more complicated picture begins to emerge. This is not simply a story about 910 crore rupees spent on newspaper advertisements. It is a story about public money. It is a story about political power. It is a story about corporate influence. And above all, it is a story about transparency. Between 2020 to 21 and 2024 to 25, the Modi government spends rupees 910.4 crore on print advertisements. That means an average of roughly rupees 182 crores every year. Among the major newspapers listed in the government data, the Times of India receives rupees 78.22 crore. Dainik Jagran receives rupees 59.14 crore. Hindustan Times receives rupees 47.80 crores. Amar Ujala receives rupees 24.92 crore. Hindustan receives rupees 21.56 crore. Dainik Bhaskar receives rupees 20.53 crores. And the Indian Express receives rupees 6.51 crore. Now, government advertising itself is not corruption. Governments elsewhere and everywhere advertise public programs, they inform citizens about welfare schemes, they announce public services, they communicate health campaigns, they issue recruitment notices, they provide information during emergencies. So the existence of government advertising cannot automatically be described as corruption. But the real question is much bigger. Who gets the money? Why do they get it? What criteria determines the distribution? And can public advertising money influence the media environment? These are questions that deserve scrutiny because when a government spends hundreds of crores on media, transparency is not optional. It is essential. And this is where the Modi government faces an even more serious controversy. Electoral bonds. In 2017, the Modi government introduced a new system of political funding called electoral bonds. The stated argument was that the system would make political funding cleaner and reduce the use of cash. But there was a major problem. The identity of the donors was kept hidden from the public. Companies and individuals could purchase these bonds and donate them to political parties without ordinary citizens knowing who was financing whom. And then came the Supreme Court. In February 2024, India's Supreme Court struck down the electoral bond scheme as unconstitutional. The court held that voters have a right to information about political funding. The judgment transformed the debate because the question was no longer simply political. The country's highest court had ruled against the system itself. And once the data was disclosed, another fact became impossible to ignore. The BJP was by far the biggest beneficiary of electoral bonds. Data released after the Supreme Court intervention showed that the BJP received the largest share of money donated through the system. According to reported data, BJP received more than rupees 6,000 crores through electoral bonds between 2018 and 2024. The numbers were enormous, but the money itself was only one part of the controversy. The bigger question was this: why was a political funding system designed in a way that ordinary voters could not see who was financing political parties? And if voters cannot know who is giving money to political parties, how can they assess whether political decisions may be influenced by financial interests? That is the central transparency question. The Supreme Court's decision made the issue even more serious. The court did not merely criticize the political debate surrounding electoral bonds. It struck the scheme down. The court found the anonymity provisions incompatible with citizens' right to information. So now consider the contradiction. The government speaks about transparency, but the system it introduced allowed political donations to remain hidden from the public. And the largest beneficiary was the BJP. That does not automatically prove a criminal exchange of money for government favors, but it creates a legitimate democratic question. Who benefits from political secrecy and who loses when voters cannot see the money trail? There is another issue. The electoral bond data revealed donations from companies that had faced scrutiny or action by government agencies. This created intense political controversy over whether financial pressure and political donations could be connected. Again, correlation alone does not prove a quid pro quo. A company donating to a political party does not automatically prove that it received a government favor. But when donations, corporate interests, and government regulatory action appear in the same timeline, citizens have every right to demand transparency. That is exactly why political finance matters, because corruption is not always about someone being caught putting cash into a suitcase. Modern political corruption can be much more complicated. It can involve influence, it can involve access, it can involve policy decisions, it can involve corporate donations, it can involve government contracts, and it can involve relationships between political power and private wealth. That is why the electoral bond controversy is so significant. It exposes the vulnerability of political systems when money enters politics without sufficient transparency. Now let us come back to the government advertising. Rupees 910.4 crore goes into print advertising over 5 years. At the same time, India's political system is dealing with a much larger question about the relationship between government and media. A free press is supposed to question those in power. It is supposed to investigate government decisions. It is supposed to challenge official claims. It is supposed to ask uncomfortable questions. But media organizations also need money to survive. Advertising provides that money. And when the government becomes a major advertiser, the relationship becomes sensitive. This does not mean every newspaper receiving government advertising becomes pro-government. It does not mean every journalist is compromised. And it does not mean government advertising automatically buys editorial support. Those claims require evidence, but the potential for influence is precisely why transparency matters. A democratic government should be able to explain how advertising is allocated. Citizens should be able to see the criteria, they should be able to examine spending, and independent institutions should be able to determine whether the system is fair. The Modi government therefore faces a question much bigger than one newspaper advertisement budget. It is a question about institutional transparency, and that brings us to another controversial relationship. Narendra Modi and India's biggest corporate groups. One name repeatedly appears in political debate, Adani. The Adani Group became the center of an international controversy after US-based short seller Heidelberg Research published allegations against the conglomerate in 2023. Heidelberg alleged corporate wrongdoing and stock manipulation. The Adani Group rejected the allegations. India's market regulator SCPI investigated the matter. The controversy also generated political questions because Gautam Adani's business empire had expanded dramatically during the years of Modi's political dominance. Critics argued that the relationship between Modi and Adani deserved greater scrutiny. The government and the BJP rejected allegations of improper favoritism. And it is important to make one thing absolutely clear. The existence of a political relationship or business success does not by itself establish corruption. But in a democracy, powerful relationships deserve scrutiny, especially when the relationship involves political leaders and some of the country's most powerful corporations. This is why the debate around Modi cannot simply be reduced to one allegation. It has to be examined through institutions, through courts, through parliamentary records, through government expenditure, through corporate disclosures, through investigating the reporting, and through financial data. Now return to the rupees 910 crore figure. Why does this number matter? Because public money creates public responsibility. If the government spends rupees 910 crore on newspapers, citizens have the right to ask whether every rupee is being used effectively. If political parties receive thousands of crores through political funding systems, citizens have the right to know who is funding them. If corporations receive major government contracts or benefit from policy changes, citizens have the right to examine the process. And if the government denies wrongdoing, it should welcome independent scrutiny. Because transparency does not weaken democracy, it strengthens it. The real problem begins when transparency becomes selective, when citizens are expected to trust the government but are denied information, when political parties demand accountability from opponents but resist scrutiny themselves, when public money becomes impossible to track, and when powerful institutions become difficult to question. That is where corruption risks emerge. And that is where journalism becomes essential. The role of journalism is not to declare someone guilty before a court does. The role of journalism is to follow the money, ask where it came from, ask where it went, ask who benefited, ask who made the decision, and ask whether the public was given the full picture. The Modi government's record must therefore be examined through evidence rather than slogans. The rupees 910 crore print advertising expenditure is documented. The electoral bond scheme is documented. The Supreme Court's decision to strike down that scheme is documented. The BJP's enormous share of electoral bond donations is documented. The controversies surrounding corporate relationships and government policy are documented. These facts can be debated, they can be defended, they can be challenged, but they cannot simply be ignored. And perhaps the biggest lesson from the electoral bonds controversy is this: transparency cannot begin after the money has already moved. It has to exist before the money changes hands. Voters should not have to wait for a Supreme Court judgment before discovering how political parties are being funded. Citizens should not have to depend on leaks before discovering where public money is going. And journalists should not have to fight for basic information about the financial relationship between governments, corporations, and political parties. A democracy cannot function on blind trust. It functions on accountability. So when we hear the claim that the Modi government represents clean governance, the correct response is not automatically to accept it, but it is also not responsible to automatically reject it. The correct response is to investigate. Look at the numbers, look at the court judgments, look at the government records, look at the money, and then ask the uncomfortable questions. Why was the electoral bond system introduced with such secrecy? Why did the Supreme Court declare it unconstitutional? Why did the BJP receive such a dominant share of that money? What safeguards exist around government advertising? How are newspapers selected? How are public advertising contracts monitored? What mechanisms prevent government advertising from influencing media independence? And when powerful corporations become major political donors, what protections exist against conflicts of interest? These questions are not anti-India. They are not anti-government. They are democratic questions. And asking them is not an attack on democracy. It is democracy. The Modi government can point toward its development programs, it can highlight infrastructure projects, it can point toward economic reforms, its supporters can defend its record. That is part of democracy too. But governments do not receive immunity from scrutiny because they have popular support. Power must always be questioned, especially when public money is involved, especially when political funding is involved, especially when powerful corporations are involved, especially when the country's highest court has already intervened in a political funding system introduced by the government. So the story of rupees 9-10 crores is not simply a story about newspaper advertisements. It opens a much bigger window into the relationship between power, money, politics and media in Modi's India. The advertising figures raises questions about public expenditure. The electoral bonds controversy raises questions about political funding. Corporate controversies raise questions about influence. And the Supreme Court judgment raises perhaps the most important question of all. Who gets to know where the money comes from? Because in a democracy, information is power. And when citizens are denied information about political money, the balance of power shifts away from the voter. That is why the Modi government's record should be examined not through slogans but through evidence, not through political loyalty but through documents, not through propaganda but through accountability. Not through accusations alone, but through facts that can withstand scrutiny. The rupees 9-10 crore in print advertising is one part of the story. The electoral bonds controversy is another. The corporate influence debate is another. Together, they raise a fundamental question about the world's largest democracy. When political power, public money, media influence, and corporate wealth intersect, who is watching the watchers? That is the question India must continue to ask, because a government should not fear scrutiny. A government that believes in transparency should welcome it, and if there is nothing to hide, there should be nothing to fear from following the money. This was Trending Daily. I am Makhdoom Shahabuddin. See you in the next episode.